My name is Gordon Caldis. I live in Grand Forks, North Dakota.
Were you drafted?
I was a senior at University of North Dakota during Pearl Harbor, and within a week I received my draft notice and demand. So the recruiters were coming into the campus, and I was concerned. I had no objection, of course, to be drafted. However, I had a semester to go to graduate, and when the recruiters came on campus, I interviewed with each of them, and one of my questions was that I would like to graduate and finish my last semester. And the only one that seemed to have a possibility was the U.S. Navy. And they advised me that with a 4-year degree, then I would be eligible for midshipman school. And in graduating from midshipman school, I could get a commission as an ensign. So I signed for the U.S. Navy, and I finished my last semester and obtained my business degree. So then I was eligible for what they called the V7 program in the Navy. And for reservists, such as I would be, they did not have room for the number of officers at Annapolis. So they set up midshipman schools at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and for Columbia University in New York. And after that, they didn't summon me right away. So a friend of mine, whom I graduated with, was also going into the V7 program. He and I had been Phi Delta fraternity brothers, and we'd played football together at UND. So we hitchhiked out to Seattle. We'd never seen the ocean, never seen a ship. So we wanted to do that, see the ocean, see some ships. And during the period that we were waiting for our orders to go to, they had selected both of us to go to Columbia University in New York. So we obtained jobs in the ship building for several months, and then we were summoned to Columbia University. So he and I took the train to New York and entered the midshipman school at Columbia University. The schooling there, I think I was just trying to think, was some 4 to 6 months. And during that time, we took a very condensed pressure schooling in the various aspects of the Navy. And there were 2 classes at Columbia at that time, each running concurrently. And each class, I think, started about 1,500 recruits, and they're completing that program. Then we were in a situation where they lay out the various possibilities of our service, and we each selected three of them, at number one, number two, number three, and I chose PT boats, and Jim Idy, my good friend from UND, he signed up for the landing craft, and landing craft were of various sizes, and so he was assigned to the largest type of the landing craft, and then I was chosen for PT boats, which had been my number one choice. Then, of course, Jim and I finally parted after being together all those years, and he went off to his training, and I went to Newport, Rhode Island, which was the only training headquarters for PT boat officers and PT enlisted men. And I went through the training there, and before going to Newport, why, my girlfriend from UND, who was Lenore Alvedal, we had, and you could not go into midshipman school as a married person. And so we waited until I finished Columbia University, be a midshipman school. I went back to Grand Forks, and we were married at United Lutheran Church. And then the two of us went back to Newport, Rhode Island, and where we lived during my training there. After we completed that, why then, in the meantime, the PT boats were being constructed in Bayonne, New Jersey, which was, and that was called Elco PT boats. There were three different styles of PT boats, and Elco was the one that we were assigned to. There were also Huckins that were in Florida, and Higgins type, which were in New Orleans. And so Lenore and I, after my training in Rhode Island, I was assigned to PT Boat Squadron 36, which was being made up in Brooklyn Navy Yard. And as the boats were constructed, they drove them over to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where they were then outfitted with the guns and the engines and all of the different fittings that go into a PT boat.
Okay, now, where was your first overseas assignment?
After our boats, the 11 boats, normally, and I never did learn why our squadron was comprised of 11 boats, because most of them were 12 boats. But at any rate, when our 11 boats were outfitted, then we were advised that we were going to, after some short training in New York, getting the enlisted men and the officers more familiar with PT boats and their operation, then that we were going to go to Europe. And so after the outfitting, why, I said goodbye to my wife Lenore, and she went back to Grand Forks, and our boats started out presumably for Europe. But after 2 or 3 days traveling on the boats, we were advised that our orders had changed and we were going to the South Pacific. So then we traveled on down south around Florida and over to the canal, where we went through the Panama Canal, and then we were lifted with huge cranes, lifted up and dropped down on, they had welded fittings on the decks of these ships, and dropped us down into the cradle, as they called them. And then they bound the boat to the cradles and with chains, and after that was done, they put 3 boats on each of the big ships, tanker ships. And after, so 3 on each ship, while all of that was being done at the same time, until the 11 boats were established and became a part of the ship. And then the ships set out for Port Moresby, which was a large island, was actually New Guinea, north of Australia. And that was the only location in the Southwest Pacific that was strong enough to lift each of the boats out and drop them down into the water. And so after all of the 11 PT boats have been waterborne, why then we started patrolling in New Guinea. We did that for some time, several months, and while progressing through New Guinea, or I should say adjacent to New Guinea, where our troops were all established and were engaged with the Japanese. And so over a period of several months, we finally proceeded through New Guinea. And after we had progressed, I would say probably at least 2/3 through New Guinea, and during that time, why the plans insofar as armament were concerned, they, instead of concentrating on torpedoes and big ships of the Japanese, our job was going to change so that we became gunboats by adding a number of additional armament. And during that transfer through New Guinea, we would stop where there were Army, our U.S. Army was located in a number of different locations, and we bummed the additional armament from the Army, which then we started installing aboard our PT boats. So by the time while patrolling, which became not too busy actually, the bulk of that was being done ashore, of course, by the U.S. Army in the infantry. But during that time, and with the assistance of some Army personnel in addition to our own, why we added all of that armament to each one of the boats. And by the time we got to about 2/3 through the New Guinea, then we got orders for the Philippines, and the job then was for the Army and the Navy, and including our squadrons, and we had some 45 PT boats in those several squadrons, and each two squadrons were attached to a big ship, supply ship, which carried all of our supplies and gasoline and food and ammunition and did our repairs. So that group then started out for the Philippines after completing all of the rearmament and getting to the departure point of New Guinea. And in leaving New Guinea, why we made 2 or 3 stops in the South Pacific leading up to arriving at the Philippines. Islands such as Palau and the name of a couple other islands escape me right now, but we would stop briefly at each one of those islands, and in each of those islands they had been invaded by our troops taking the island back. So then we, after doing some repairs and that type of thing at 1 or 2 of those islands, why then we finally got to the point where we were at the Philippines.
Now, did you have any problems with any Japanese boats coming after you?
We did not being underway across the ocean and leading up to each island. We did not, the PT boats, did not have any confrontation with the Japanese. All of that was going on the island itself. Our troops invading and taking each of those islands, and we were not engaged in those 2 or 3 islands until then. After arriving at the Philippines, then we set up our PT boat squadrons and supply ships at a certain location within one of the big bays in the island of Leyte. And what was going on there is that our Navy was preparing for the big confrontation with the several Japanese fleets. And we arrived there just shortly before the first invasion or recapture, I'll put it that way, by the U.S. Against the Japanese was our Army taking over in the east coast of the island of Leyte, and their job being to proceed through and drive out the Japanese. And our function was to, and assignment was, for each of our patrols, we would our commander would would assign 2 or 3 divisions of PT boats, and a division being 2 boats, so that we would have 2 boats placed in certain areas on the west coast of Leyte, and each 2 boats division would be assigned a certain area of several miles, and so there would be about 4 of those assignments, all from the south to the north of Leyte, and our patrols were all at night. And so we had those assignments, separate assignments, so that we would not run into one another and shoot up one another, but that covered all of the area to prevent supplies and personnel, Japanese supplies and personnel, from reinforcing the Japanese that had possession of Leyte Island. And so all during the night, why we would patrol so that there wouldn't be any space or any room for reinforcements by the Japanese going ashore on the west coast of Leyte. And so during those patrols, and then at dawn, why we would leave the area, go around the south end of Leyte, back up into the Leyte Gulf where our supply ships were. And then the next night there'd be another group of PT boats that would go through the same pattern and cover the whole west coast of Leyte.
Did the Japanese try to get through you?
Yes. There were numerous, by a number of divisions intercepting the Japanese supply boats. And those were usually smaller craft, but they'd be personnel. They would probably be, we called them barges, but they were good-sized barges. You know, they might be 80, 90, 100 feet long, and some of them would carry personnel, some would be ammunition and supplies for the troops that, for the Japanese troops that were engaged with our army coming from the east. And so, for example, one of the probably more interesting engagements that we had during our patrols, of course, you had no lights on your PT boat, and it was just at the slowest speed that we could set, and that was because with our powerful engines, if you put on any speed, the engines were so noisy, so we would just coast along. They had flaps on each of the exhausts, which would force the exhaust underwater and made very little noise. We had, on each of the PT boats, we had 1,200 horse aircraft engines, and we carried 3 engines in each boat, and so that even though we could actually, if we had to, we could go probably 55 miles an hour. But all of our patrols, unless we became involved in an engagement with the enemy, was just at slow speed. So we didn't alert the enemy, and of course on our PT boats we had radar, very good radar, where that radar, of course, was the big advantage that we had. With that radar, it showed little pips if the rays from the radar would strike an object, why it would show as a little pip on the screen. And by the size of the pip, we could tell fairly well the size of the boat that it was disclosing to us. And in that instance, of course, we didn't expect much in the way of big ship Navy, but the supply ships of the Japanese. And so, for example, and I think I mentioned that each division was 2 boats.
Right.
And the lead boat captain would be designated as the division commander for that patrol. And of course, it consisted of 2 boats. But the captain in the lead boat was in constant talk radio with the second boat, and it was imperative that the 2 boats would be close together, the second one following very close, so that we didn't get confused with one another. And then if we spotted anything, why then the second boat would have to follow very closely. And in the lead boat captain would have a microphone in each hand. And the one patrol that I'll mention now, it just so happened that I had been designated as the division commander of the 2-boat division this particular night. And so the executive officer of each boat at that time would be on the wheel and be in constant touch with the quartermaster, who would be down in the cockpit and would be reporting the radar. And so the executive officer would be at the wheel and following the radar's direction, and the captain and the division commander, which I was that particular night, had a radio microphone in my right hand, and then the giving orders not only to our executive officer, who was at the wheel. In my left hand would have a microphone that was connected to the second boat, so that I had to give orders, or that individual had to give orders, not only to the second boat, but to the executive officer and the radar man on my boat. So on this particular night, we ran into, on the radar, a bunch of pips, and you could even see the location, their formation, and pretty much the size of each of the craft. And in this particular night, there were quite a number of smaller pips, and then there were 3 larger pips, and obviously the larger craft were protecting all of the smaller pips. So we knew that they were the escorts, and the personnel and the supply barges were the smaller pips, and then protected around by the larger craft. And so we followed them, and they were headed into shore. And so I gave the command that we would make a circle, and asking the second boat to follow closely, because I wanted to get around and go up to the head craft of the Japanese, who were proceeding into shore from some distance out, probably a mile from shore. And so the two of us made a big circle, and they still hadn't spotted us, which was a great advantage to have that radar. And these smaller craft of the Japanese did not have or would not have radar. They didn't know we were even there. We were going very slow speed, not making any noise. And we went back to the head and then circle around so that we would turn exactly going in the opposite direction of the enemy, and pulled in the two boats, and getting back so that we would be hitting or arriving at the first of the supply boats of the Japanese. So there we were, our two PT boats, one after the other. And so then when we were just about to arrive at the first craft, Japanese craft, why I gave orders to the second boat to train all of our hardware in the same direction. And then when we got to the first craft, the Japanese craft, I gave orders with my right hand and also the mic on the left hand to prepare to fire. And so then when we hit the first one, I announced to each of the two boats, fire when ready. And so from then on, why the captain of that other boat and mine, my boat, why commenced the firing. And so there we were, two broadsides, which was a lot of armament, and proceeding slowly to the head of all the pips. And they immediately, why, of course, they were hitting the Japanese. They were setting them afire. They were exploding, and you could see the men then, the Japanese, and so they were, our gunners were hitting and sinking, setting them afire. And the escorts, the three escorts, were surrounding the Japanese smaller craft. And on the first run to the head, to the back end of the Japanese flotilla, why, we nailed one of the larger craft, and I'll call them PT boats because they were very comparable to the size of our PT boats, and we think that they were Japanese PT boat style. Well, we nailed one of the escort Japanese PT boats, and I'm not really sure how many of the supply boats, but many of them. And then when we arrived at the end of that Japanese flotilla, I gave orders to make another signaled directional change, turn to the left. And then we speeded up, made the big circle, and the idea was to go back, all the way back to the first of the Japanese craft, and so we could make another run exactly as the first one. So we made the second run, and we nailed another of the escort, the big escort Japanese PT boats, and innumerable of the supply ships. And by that time, then the escort, the PT escorts, there were 2 of them left, and they took off. Well, we had done well. I think we'd virtually demolished all of the supply and personnel barges. So I gave the order to the second boat. I said, let's chase down the other 2 Japanese PT boats. They were together, and they were running. Well, they did not have radar. We had radar, and of course, it was a dead of night, black as it could be. So we started chasing them, and and we caught up with them, and we made a run on them. We nailed another one of the PT boats. Then the last PT boat took off, and so we let that go because we were in the process of sinking that second one, and so I did not want our second boat to leave me because we might get confused chasing, all over the hinterland. So we let the one go. We chased the second one, and we nailed it, sunk it, and so then we made another big circle to go back to where we had sunk these other barges, and they were all gone, either demolished or vanished. And so that was one of our that was the completion of that particular night, and very successful. And so you can imagine those supplies and personnel would have reinforced the Japanese army on Lady Island.
Now, were you around when MacArthur came back?
Yes.
Did you have a chance to see that, or?
Yes.
Oh.
We were present.
Oh.
In one of my pictures, I could point out,
Okay.
I have that on the table.
Okay, we'll get that.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, it was really quite thrilling in a way because, General MacArthur, of course, was very, very famous, and he was commander of the South Pacific Army and Navy, and of course well known, and so he came in on a battle wagon, and and with a battle wagon, of course, you've got destroyers, and see, this was the 7th Fleet, one of the big fleets, famous fleets of the U.S. Navy, which had the assignment of taking care of the south end of the Philippines. And I might just say that this is a little aside, but in this meantime, before before we'd arrived at the Philippines, the Japanese code, overall code, had been broken by the U.S. And we knew this too because it was passed to all those that were in the area and would be involved. But the Japanese had organized for what obviously was its last big charge as far as winning the war. And they had 3 fleets that were coming from in the north end of the Philippines from the west, a middle fleet and these were in the back west side of the Philippines. They had a fleet coming in on the north, they had a fleet coming in the middle of the Philippines, and they had a fleet coming in to the southern part of the Philippines on the west side. And this was a surprise from their standpoint. But the U.S. knew about it and of course set up our 3 huge fleets on the east side of the Philippines. 1 fleet up on the north, 1 fleet in the middle, and 1 fleet in the south. So each fleet having its opponent. And the 7th Fleet, so we were on the south end of the Philippines. And so the Japanese fleet was coming from the west around the south end of the Philippines and going to proceed up through Surigao Straits up into Leyte Bay and Leyte Gulf, they call it. And our 7th Fleet was waiting in Leyte Gulf. And that was the Surigao Straits was, and the entrance from the south was comparatively narrow. And so our job, the PTs, and we had, I think it was 42 boats, PT boats, in Surigao Straits, ranged in zones all the way from the north to the south end. And the Japanese fleet, of course, was coming up from the west to the entrance of Surigao Straits and to proceed up this comparatively narrow straits, still quite wide, but comparatively from a battle wagon standpoint, why, it was good size. But our boats, PT boats, were ranged all along the east coast, all of them with torpedoes. And our function, basically, and that was when the Japanese fleet hit the entrance, then the closest PT boats to the south end, my boat and others were about in the middle, and then there was a north group of PT boats. The southernmost PT boats were then in radio contact with the 7th Fleet up in the bay, giving them their speed and how many there were and what they were, so that they gave notice then what the 7th Fleet was going to need, what was going to meet. And then each PT boat division all the way up were to proceed towards the oncoming fleet, Japanese fleet, which incidentally was going at flank speed. But our job then after was to fire our torpedoes. So all of the torpedoes on the PT boats went as the Japanese fleet proceeded north. And of course we were going in prior to firing our torpedoes. And then our job was to make your circle, get away from them, and proceed back. And then, so then what was happening is that with the notice from our southernmost PT boats to the 7th Fleet as to timing and speed and number, why, what the 7th Fleet did then up in Leyte Gulf was to what they call cross the T. They lined up and blocked the entrance to Leyte Gulf. So the Japanese, what they were going to do is run smack into just a phalanx of battle wagons and cruisers and destroyers. Well, that's some mileage up there, you know, between the south end of the Surigao Straits and the Gulf. But so as far as PT boats, of course, the Japanese fleet passed by. We had fired our torpedoes, and of course our little guns had no effect. In fact, as we charged in, why, of course, we got some blistering firecraft at the PT boats. So of course we did as ordered. We circled around and ran to the east, and but we were getting peppered, but it was a dead of night, and what most of us did, we carried a smoke tank, and which was a white smoke. And what most of the PT boats did is as they were turning and escaping from the Japanese fleet, they'd let a puff of smoke go. Well, what that did is that was an immediate attraction for the Japanese fleet gunneries. So instead of firing at us, they were firing at the smoke puffs. And that was the idea. It was to distract and get us out of line of fire. But in the meantime, then, of course, the head of the Japanese fleet came up to the Gulf, and there was the phalanx of the 7th Fleet blocking off the Japanese fleet. Well, what they did, the Japanese, and this is where they get the term crossing the T. The Japanese had to cross the T. They couldn't go forward. They'd be running right into the 7th Fleet. So they all turned to the left, following one another across, so that they were exposing themselves to the one broadside of the 7th Fleet, and they just blistered that Japanese fleet. They had to proceed, and then turn tail and go back south. Well, the 7th Fleet really damaged that Japanese fleet, and as a practical matter, and this was happening to the north. You know, there's the north and the middle and the south, and as a practical matter, that was the end of the war.
Gordon, were you there when MacArthur came into the island?
Yes.
Whereabouts were you?
Our squadron was in the vicinity. See, each one of our squadron supply ships had 2 squadrons attached to one supply ship, and our so we of the 40 some 45 boats. Well, I see there was two squadrons to each one of the supply ships, and at that time, up in the northern part of Leyte Gulf, why our supply ships and squadrons were located, and which at the time was in a fairly quiet area, and where the boats were being serviced and get gasoline, supplies, and food and ammunition and so on. And so the squadron commanders decided, when there was a request by someone in MacArthur's staff, that they wanted a PT boat to make this function of carrying MacArthur in onto the shore, and so that they'd set up all their cameras and so on, and establish his I shall return publicity. And so out of the blue, the request was made to Squadron 36 to do this with MacArthur. And then our squadron commander picked PT Boat 525 to do this. And so that's how that came about. So then the 525 boat then proceeded to the battle wagon and picked up General MacArthur and his staff, and they went aboard the 525. And then the 525 then carried the general and his staff to the area where all of the cameras were set up on the shore and were getting set for his entrance. And so the PT boat actually went up as close as it could to the shore, and then couldn't get in, real close, but as close as it could. So MacArthur was first in on, waded in up to about his knees, and then walked up into a small craft that had a drop on the front, so he could walk up into the craft itself. And then that smaller personnel craft turned around, proceeded out a little farther, and then he climbed aboard the PT boat. And so then the PT boat made a circle and came back, and when he got in as close as he could, then the general transferred back to this smaller personnel craft, which then proceeded in to about where it was knee deep for the general, and then he walked down the ramp of that small craft into the water and waded in. But because he left and escaped on a PT boat, he wanted to return on a PT boat.
Got it.
So that's why all
And they
of
go
that
through
took
this
place. Yeah.
picture here. You can. Were you there watching MacArthur come on shore?
Yes.
Okay. What happened next? How long were you in the Philippines? When did you get to go back?
Well, let's see. After the Battle of Leyte, we had our next assignment was to to go up to the northernmost province of the Philippines, which was Luzon, Luzon. And when you look on the map, it's the northernmost section of the Philippines. And we were sent up there to see if there was any cleanup that was necessary, because our troops had pretty much taken control over Luzon. You know, while we were going along on the south in Leyte, our squadrons, while our troops were in Luzon, recapturing that. But it so happened that we got up there and started patrols, and we found that there was very little action, actually. But they kept us there for a while. And so finding very little combat to do, why then they decided to send our group of PT boats to Borneo. And the function in Borneo, now geographically, Borneo is right below the southernmost part of the Philippines. And Borneo had been very important and had been one of the first things taken over by the Japanese because of all their oil. And they wanted the oil. And so they took over the oil fields in Borneo. And the Dutch, this was Dutch Borneo. And of course they had possession of that and had dug the oil wells and were using the oil, and consequently for years had done that. And they had established little settlements around the oil wells operated by the Dutch. And so and all of this, the oil wells were in the interior of that part of Borneo. And the only access to them was through narrow rivers from the coast. And so our size boats, they thought, really fit that, because you had to go up into the interior. And so they chose the PT boats. And so we wended our way up the rivers and channels and so on into the interior. And there the Australians and the U.S. had entered into an agreement where Borneo would be taken over by the Australian Army, and we would be the Navy for the Australians. In this way, they had not invaded ashore yet, the Australians. So what they decided was that our PT boats would be the softening try to soften the Japanese in territory where the Australians were going to invade and go ashore. So we had a string of PT boats in file that made, when they decided, we did some patrols first getting in there, but had very little action. But because they didn't have any, the Japanese didn't seem to have any planes down there. See, all during this time, we were battling kamikaze planes up in Leyte. That was the big thing. And everybody was subject to that. There were hundreds of kamikaze planes that were, if you're familiar with kamikaze, those were the pilots that drove their planes into the targets.
Mm-hmm.
And that was going on all the time. And they were after PT boats and big ships, everybody, until of course they kind of ran out on kamikazes. But at any rate, our job in Borneo was to proceed back and forth the invasion area, single file, so that we were from a number, and I forget how many PT boats in line, but there probably were maybe at least 2 squadrons in our area that single file went back and forth the beach where the Aussies were going to invade. And with single file PT boats and 2 or 3 squadrons, all of the armament was just a solid line of armament, and 40 millimeters, 20 millimeters, and of course twin 50 calibers, anti-aircraft, and so a powerful roll of firepower. Well, and just blindly shooting into the woods where they were going to go. And of course the Japanese were behind in the woods. And so we made several circles of that number of PT boats. The idea being to just saturate that whole area with all of that shelling, to drive the Japanese back and maybe kill a lot of them, possibly. But that was our function for the Navy, for the Australians. And as a consequence, we finished that. They invaded and took back the territory for the Dutch.
Where were you when they dropped the nuclear bomb?
Let's see. I was. We were in Borneo.
Okay.
We were in Borneo, and the 522 boat was the first boat of constructed for Squadron 36, and I was assigned to that first boat. The 523, of course, was next.
How did you get news of the bomb, of the nuclear bomb? How did you find out?
I think we found out when we were on the Jim Wolfe was the captain of the 523, and we were the first 2 boats that went overseas of our squadron, and so they said we were eligible to go first back home, and so that was in Borneo. So they advised us of that, and they said, well, you're on your own. We have to hitchhike back. So what we did, so we left the Borneo, and there was an army base not too far, but where Jim Wolfe and I went, and then the first supply plane that came in and left, why we asked him if we could hitch a ride, which would take us back to a departure point of a troop ship back in New Guinea, and so that we left there, and during that trip, our first was I don't know how many hour plane ride to New Guinea, and then we got off at this army base, and they were loading a troop ship to go back to Long Beach, to the United States. So they allowed us to hitchhike on the troop ship, and of course that took to get back to Long Beach oh gosh, 2 or 3 weeks because they're so slow, you know.
Hmm.
And so when we were on the troop ship, then through the troop ship radio and so on, why we got word of the atomic bomb.
So when you got back to Long Beach, then is that point you got separated from the service?
No,
Oh,
no. Jim Wolfe and I, we parted there. Uh, he and I decided we'd go to a swanky hotel, and we went to the Ambassador and to stay overnight, and then we'd separate. He was going to take a train to Texas, and I was going to take a train to Grand Forks. And interesting note there, we took from Long Beach. We took a cab to the Ambassador Hotel, and we were unloading our gear. You know, we had a sack. And we're getting out of the cab, and someone tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around, and it was Clark Gable, and and he had been with a bunch of officers, admirals, and so on. They were going into the hotel. He left them. He was in uniform, and came up to us, and quizzed us a little bit about our experience, and what we'd gone through, and so on. And then he congratulated us, and then he went back to his group. And then Jim and I stayed overnight at the Ambassador. Next day, we took our trains home.
now at that point, when you got home, were you out of the service then?
No,
Okay.
they had not processed us that far. Where we had to go immediately, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. From there, they sent. I asked where they were going to send me, and they said, "Well, they're sending you back to Rhode Island, to our training center." So I went back there, and it was just for a matter of, well, I didn't know how long, because apparently I had to serve so much time, some rough time, that before I'd be released. So they sent me back to Rhode Island, and then after a few days, they sent me to Great Lakes, which is out of Chicago. And so I went back, I flew back there, and I reported to the Great Lakes. And I said, "Well, what's my assignment?" No one knew my specific assignment. So I said, "Well, we have a naval headquarters in Minneapolis at the airport." And I said, "Can you send me there?" Well, it took a day or two, and they finally arranged that they'd send me to the separation center at Minneapolis. And so I took the train there, reported in, and what they were doing at the separation center is that was the separation point where the Navy guys were reporting in, processed, and sent home. So when I got there, the commander, the officer in charge of the separation center, was an attorney from Grand Forks. He was still in the Navy, and he had, he was in charge of the separation center, and so I checked in and was there for several days, when suddenly they sent the attorney, they released him, separated him, and then they appointed me in charge of the separation center. I was a full lieutenant, 2 stripes, and so I was in charge after it was Hughesby was his name, the attorney, Lyle Hughesby. He had practiced in Grand Forks, but at any rate, so I was the commander there, I think, for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and then they separated me. And then I went to Grand Forks. And when I got home, I found out that I was a father. Never heard about it. My oldest son, Jack.
I guess the mail never caught up with you.
Mail never caught us, and that was for something over a year. No correspondence, because we were moving so fast.
Sure.
Yeah. You know, through New Guinea, through the Philippines, through Borneo, never caught up.